it's a real pleasure to be with you today, not just because this is the last talk before my summer break, but also because, of course, I welcome very much any opportunity to discuss my work in progress ideas about citizen agency. As someone, of course, is a citizen of the Datafied society, besides someone who has been studying social movements and civil society, how do they react and interact with threats and possibilities of the so-called big data and everything that goes with technological innovation, including artificial intelligence. Of course, this is, the issue of agency is very close to my heart. Now, I have prepared a PowerPoint for you. Let me find it. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna, oh no, wait a second. I need another PowerPoint. Where did it go? I'm traveling, so I don't have my regular computer. Oh, a second. For some reason, doesn't. Yes, there it is. Doesn't want to open. Yep. All right. Sorry. Yeah, I share my screen. You see also my mental chaos. People's screens is always a bit confusing. But at least see that we're all pretty chaotic and all delayed pretty much anything. So I play my slide deck from the start. So agency, as I said. So I welcome definitely the opportunity to discuss agency, but I have to say once again that this is work in progress. I've approached the notion of agency from a variety of disciplinary subfields. So currently I work in a media studies department and I engage extensively with the emerging field of critical data studies, but I am a sociologist, political sociologist by training, verging on political science. I've worked also in other, cognitive disciplines. So of course, the question of agency is approached in a slightly different manner by each and every of those. But as you're going to notice, there is a lot of sociological background in this talk. So in the interplay, for example, between agency and structure, as we sociologists like to put it. But of course, my engagement with media studies and with the nitty-gritty of technological infrastructures, they are making the challenges and everything that goes from their governance to deep in the stack of technological creation. Looking, for example, in my last project now, together with some colleagues at even technology standards. My understanding of agency evolves precisely in relation with all of this. Meaning I'm trying to look for spaces to carve out, to reclaim agency vis-a-vis a technological environment, which is more and more complicated and more challenging for us citizens to make sense of, and I'm gonna have some examples in my talk today, but also of course to literally deal with technological innovation becoming more and more complex and more something in the hands of a handful of very powerful corporations. You understand that also our possibilities for agency or reclaiming agency evolve and change, and it becomes increasingly complicated for our citizens to do so. So a few years ago, I believe this was 2017, Scientific American, popular magazine, titled "Will Democracy Survive Big Data and Artificial Intelligence?" And the subtitle went, "We are in the middle of a technological upheaval that will transform the way society is organized. We must make the right decisions now." Now, if this was true a few years ago, it's even more true today. And democracy being probably not a perfect system, but definitely the best system we have available and the one that upholds the biggest, the most extensive human rights protection to its citizens, then the question is not a trivial one, and is definitely still open for answers and experimentation. We also see how, and I want to start with some examples. This is news from 2020. This was right before the inception of the pandemic, or let's say the pandemic was not yet a problem in the European continent. It was already a problem, unfortunately, in China. they have not yet arrived to us, let's say, and to us here in this part of the world. And The Guardian went public with this very disturbing news from London. So the Met Police, the Metropolitan Police in the City of London, was to begin using facial recognition cameras in London. Now, if you have ever visited London, and probably a lot of the audience today comes from the United Kingdom, well, you're very familiar with the extensive CCTV, closed circuit television system that monitors pretty much anything in the city, every city corner, squares, but of course the tube and various other forms of public transport. So it is a presence, right? It has been a presence for several decades now. But the idea here by the Met Police, and in fact the implementation, I mean, the citizens were confronted with this decision, but it was already in place. And this is something to keep into account. And so, you know, when we think about agency vis-a-vis technology today, so facial recognition cameras are the next level up in the matter of intrusive technology. Why? What happens? Facial recognition technology is technology that operates in the realm of artificial intelligence that enables real-time decisions about the matching and about identity. What do I mean? So you have a camera that, you know, takes a picture of my face. In fact, a facial recognition technology works on probability. So what the software does is to measure the distance between certain points, you know, of my face. So not exactly take a full scan of the face, but measure very individual distances and match this, you know, identity that is created by measuring distance from between different spots in the face with existing data sets. Now, there is a fair chance that if you have ever been walking around town in London, but not only, but also if you have been on social media, or if your picture has appeared on social media, maybe published, not by yourself, but even by some of your, you know, acquaintances or family and friends, well, you are in these databases. What databases I'm talking about? They are law enforcement databases that include not only people who have committed crimes, but also citizens in general. And what happens is that essentially in real time, there is a decision made by the software as to whether the person, like in this case, me walking in downtown London, let's say, corresponds to, you know, a face in this collection of pre-existing databases. And then, you know, if I've committed a crime before, which is likely not the case, then I might be identified as a potential criminal, and I might have been identified as someone who has committed a crime, should be punished for that, and maybe it's on the run and so on and so forth. So essentially, this is technology that gives software the possibility of making determinations about people's identity, but literally means that we walk around town carrying, is the equivalent of carrying our passport, right, open in front of our face. So we give away our identity through these facial recognition cameras. I say we give away in the sense that it is our own identity, but of course it's sort of extracted from us by the technology. Now, as you can see from you know, the article here from The Guardian, this was repeated January 2020, The Guardian reported growing civil liberties groups' concerns over what they consider a breathtaking assault on our rights. Another British group called Liberty actually said this is arsenic into the water of democracy. But what disturbs me in all of this, not only the fact that facial recognition is indeed intrusive, and it has been, and I'm going to mention that in a bit, it's become more and more prominent actually with, and thanks to, unfortunately, the pandemic as a techno-solutionism measure to fight the pandemic. But what is disturbing in all this process is that citizens have never been asked whether they agree with this move. So citizens of London, well, there's been a survey done by the Met Police saying that over 80% of Londoners approve the move by the Met Police. Of course, the police presented it as a great occasion to, for example, help retrieving disappeared children or people. That's of course, I mean, it was against that, right? But what is disturbing is that, well, two things at least. One is, in fact, that citizens have not been asked to, nor has the local administration, made a vote, for example, on that, but or the parliament, because once you do something in London, it's quite likely that you also do it in other parts of the country, or also in other parts of where I live, for example, in Amsterdam. But the other disturbing factor is that, in fact, an independent study of the success rate of this identification through facial recognition cameras actually pointed to a disturbing amount of false positives, namely 81%. So out of 8 out of 10 identifications made by the software, 8 are wrong and about 2 are correct. So imagine if you are erroneously identified as a criminal, what might happen to you, right? We fortunately live in a democratic state. I mean, the UK is no exception, but it might take you a while to prove the software wrong. So this is, yet another case, and you see that the source if you want to know more about how, it can be this is a source of concern if you care about citizen agency in the Datafied society. But as I mentioned, things have gotten possibly worse with the pandemic. Why is that? Well, because of course, in the attempt to, in a way or another, curb the diffusion, but also the social costs of the virus, governments and companies have resorted to technological solutions that were often not even really well tested. So they were piloted in real time during the pandemic. Think about, well, this is not actually the case. This is a case of technology that is well established already, but here the facial recognition technology is a bit more problematic. And I'm thinking here about, for example, thermal cameras. Thermal cameras have existed in airports throughout the world, especially in Asia, for a long, long time. Now they have been, implemented pretty much anywhere. The last talk I've given live in October last year in Italy, for example, in a festival where people were wearing their masks, but we were expected to go through the facial recognition process. Well, it was a thermal scanning, right? So they wanted to identify whether we were running a temperature, so as a potential, symptom of COVID-19, and that's very legitimate. But at the same time, that camera also implemented facial recognition. So the question is, who's going to see those data, and what are these data being then used for? Now, the fact that we all carried for a while, and in some countries still carry a mask that partially covers our face, meant that facial recognition technology has advanced in trying also to, basically do work without necessarily, this part of the face. So as you can imagine, things things are evolving in a way that the COVID pandemic has, and this is hopefully the topic of my next project, is promoted in a way, has fostered the adoption of a very specific mode of governance of the social, which is a governance by data infrastructure, whereby, for example, functions that were previously the prerogative of public administrations or other forms of security forces are now in the hands of software and various forms of technology. And it might work, might not work. And we're going to see in a minute an example of when things probably do not work or do not work as well as they should. And then it becomes very difficult for us little human beings to seek redress against, for example, a software that we culturally believe is totally infallible, right? This brings me to talk about briefly another reason of concern. And I have an article together with 3 awesome colleagues. It's coming out soon from the European Journal of Risk Regulation, so watch out for that. It's open access, a short commentary on the perils and the false promises of immunity of vaccination passports. As you know, various European countries have implemented them. I stick to Europe because, of course, it's the realm that know the best. But there's, if you go, for example, to Asia, these things have been in place for much longer, with, paired with contact tracing apps. That in some cases, like in the case of Singapore, were then compulsory. In Europe, they're typically not compulsory, although they are using, the carrot and stick approach to make people adopt them. I mean, it was news in the UK not long ago that they wanted to make the passport compulsory to enter in pubs as a way to nudge young people into vaccinating themselves, which is, in my humble opinion, as a big fan of vaccines, of course, a very good idea, but at the same time, one that is also, creepy from the point of view of citizen agency, but especially because the technology is not yet very, very good. But if we stick to the European Union, you see a tweet from the 1st of March by Ursula von der Leyen. That is now from the 1st of July also reality. So this is the digital green pass to travel across the European Union. I don't know what about the UK, frankly, but that carries, so it's an app or a QR code that sometimes built on an app, the existing concentration app in the country of origin, or you can also carry it as a piece of paper. And let's say I have nothing against a piece of paper. I have much more reservations about the app. But essentially what this was supposed to do, in the words of Ursula von der Leyen, is a proof that a person has been vaccinated or has been tested recently, the results of the tests, but also info on any, if you have been infected and you recovered. And they promise us that this will respect data protection, security, and privacy, but there's other things that such a passport has not made apparent, or the plans have really not carefully considered, meaning, for example, questions of interoperability. So the fact that all of a sudden, if this works to cross borders, then information has to be shared with border authorities. They have to be shared across countries. So these are healthcare information that were first just shared within the country system, sometimes within regions, like the case of Italy, where we have a regionalized healthcare system, but also especially what this plan ignores is the dimension of inequality. If it was difficult for certain nationalities, certain people to enter, for example, Fortress Europe before, it's even more so, because think about the fact that a lot of countries in the global south simply do not have the financial capacities of acquiring the vaccine. So their populations are even less likely to be able to enter the European Union now that they have been in the past. So we write about that together. I write about that together with Lynette Taylor from Tilburg University, Stella Gerses from Technical University Delft, and Michael Vio from University College London. And together we put, we bring together our some points that come from an interdisciplinary discussions, given Michael is a lawyer, Sid is a computer scientist, Lynette is a development studies expert, and I'm a sociologist. So, but these are just examples on how essentially citizen agency is, eroded today, if you want. If you want to move then to the global south, that's one example that was made apparent by my colleague Silvia Masero, that together with myself and Emiliano Treres edited a book, open access book, called COVID-19 from the Margins, that I invite you all to read, that reflects in fact on the challenges from the pandemic on communities at the margins, so poor, vulnerable communities, anything from countries in the global south, but also all the various forms of vulnerability and poverty that exist, for example, in Western, or if you want, developed rich countries. Well, from that book, you find a number of examples of how COVID has put these people even further at risk, and COVID being the first pandemic of the Datafied society, as I wrote with my colleague Philip De Salvo, who is actually now at the LSE in London. Well, you understand that technology then contributes even further to erode citizen agency in these very difficult times. This picture comes from Sylvia's fieldwork in India. In India, there is a food protection, so poverty protection scheme, whereby poor families and impoverished families are offered food and household items, if you have some detergent and soap and stuff like that, anything they might need to support their family. This is a state program. Now the problem is that India is as the biggest digital identity scheme in the world, called Aadhaar, something that a number of local NGOs have criticized because it is a biometric system, extremely intrusive. If you want to have access to this protection scheme, You have to have another identity. So, then you understand how privacy becomes a luxury choice. So if you want to protect your privacy, then, you might not have access to food subsidies, and that might be a problem if you're poor, right? And the problem is that with the pandemic, so the biometric identification system via fingerprint, so a little machine that would identify you as the right recipient, as the person entitled to receive this, this food subsidies, stopped working. Not because there was a technical hurdle. I mean, usually technology is solid, it works, but the problem was essentially that the government decided to suspend identification via fingerprints because in the first months of the pandemic, it was unclear how the virus would be spread, right? They also wanted to avoid, people clustering together. And this meant very brutally that people could not get access to food subsidies. This actually means dying for some people, right? It means extreme poverty, or even further falling into, the trap of poverty. So it means malnourished children and so on and so forth. And all of this, if you want, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of this digital identity system that over-relies on technology that clearly was not COVID-proof. So these are just some examples to show how we should care about agency today, but also we should ask ourselves, how is agency, citizen agency, political agency, however you want to call it, changing over time in this increasingly complex technological environment? And ultimately, is there anything we can do, right, to reclaim that agency? And luckily, there's a number of creative solutions from the field that I want to share with you. So this is, if you want, my very lengthy introduction, but this is something that with a variety of groups and with a variety of people, we've been trying to map. And that's why the COVID-19 from the emerges, but also to observe closely, because these things are developing at the speed of light. And in fact, I want to mention that there are good developments also, not only negative developments, also for facial recognition technology in Europe, but I'm going to say something on that later. So it's not only bad news, right? There's also good news, or tiny little pieces of good news that however, we as citizens, not just as scholars, should act upon if we do want to see the change in the world that we need to see. So we have seen how, so we studied from this slide, will democracy survive big data and artificial intelligence? Well, big question, but what we can, I mean, I don't have an answer for now, right? I very much hope so, but definitely democracy, liberal democracy at least, is due to change. It's definitely due to evolve, and necessarily, not necessarily for the better, with an increasing role for software in decision making when it comes to, for example, I don't know, even the welfare state, for example, and I have an example from the Netherlands, but also with what I mentioned earlier, governance by data infrastructure, whereby software, but also apps, interfaces, dashboards, the so-called smart city are going to be more and more a feature in our life. They already are. And definitely what this is doing is to accelerate the crisis of liberal democracy. Why do I say that? Well, that we have such bad weather in the Netherlands that I got a little bit of a cold. So why crisis of liberal democracy? I'm not sure how many politologists there are, political scientists there are in this crowd today, but it's not news for scholars of political science that the liberal democracy has been in a crisis for a number of decades now. Why is that? Think about voting, voter turnout, so less and less people that vote, especially amongst the young generation, which signals in a way a sort of disaffection towards the mechanisms of representative democracy. But also, of course, the rise across the world from Brazil to India and counting, but also very much in Europe. Think about, I mean, for example, the case of Italy in the recent past, but also, of course, Hungary and others, of populist parties and populist governments that, verge on authoritarianism, at least for certain features, for certain behaviors of their governors. So these are indications indeed of an ongoing crisis of liberal democracy. Think also about the push from the bottom up to use internet or various platforms for enhancing and promoted participatory forms of democracy, whereby people are invited to have a say regularly, not just on occasions of voting. So all of these point to a necessary change in a way, or pressures and tensions that exist from the bottom up, but also from the top down, if you want to use that metaphor. But what is new from the point of view of a scholar of big data and AI like myself is that datification is indeed contributing to this crisis. How is that the case? Well, in the Netherlands, for example, I don't know how much you follow Dutch politics, but it was probably news globally, the fact that the government collapsed, so resigned, at the end of January this year, I believe, February, early this year, on a very controversial algorithmic failure. So what am I talking about? So there was an algorithm, series of algorithms, in fact, that were used to detect fraud in welfare subsidies. Most, in particular, subsidies that were distributed to families in need to support children and children education. So it's legitimate that a state wants, of course, to detect fraud and try to prevent fraud, and so that just to use available funds to reach those in need. And fraud has existed, since ever, right? But what these algorithms was designed to do, and in a very controversial, very systemic manner, was to identify as potential, so misidentify as people who committed fraud, especially, so it was biased towards families or individuals with a foreign surname, with a dual citizenship, and with or living residents of low-income neighborhoods. So this, you understand, is extremely problematic because not only, of course, these are the often, second-generation migrants, first-generation migrants are indeed still in a very divided society like the Netherlands, still in need, unfortunately, of subsidies. But why should people with another skin color be more suspect than others of fraud? And this was done through the algorithms, right? And this created, the problem was that a number of families were asked to return large amounts of sums that they had received over the years. Some that were asked to return 33,000 euros. And this is something that an impoverished family can simply not do, with all the consequences of the case, right? That you have to, desperation, confusion, but also a sense of unfairness. Because in most cases, the software was absolutely wrong. So this created a big, big scandal, and with the help also of some digital rights organizations that brought this, to the general public. This was denounced, and it brought to the government, it forced the government to resign. But this is yet another example of how, when we introduce software in making crucial decisions about, for example, who is poor or who needs our support, things might get wrong. Now, you may ask, yeah, okay, but local administrations making determinations about whether you should be a recipient of welfare support can also make mistakes. Yes, that's very true. But as a matter of fact, it's easier to seek redress and correction when you have a human being on the other side. Whereas there's this cultural tendency amongst not only local administration, but also amongst us as individuals to kind of believe that the software must be right, whereas human beings might make a mistake. So datification as and software and decision-making made by software, and even more so when we move into the realm of artificial intelligence, machine learning, so software that learns from its own behavior and then starts taking decisions that are not even understandable or apparent to its own creators, then this definitely accelerates the crisis that I was talking about. So if you look at what we might conceive as the human-machine interactions, well, they're often biased and bias in favor of machine decision making. And conversely, they put citizen sovereignty, citizen control as one key dimension of citizen agency at risk. And all the examples that I brought up probably have convinced you that there is this tension, right? And that on the one hand, you have software and technological innovation that does more and more. And on the other hand, you have a society which unfortunately is still today not sufficiently literate about the risks and the opportunities. And this concerns not only average citizens, right, citizens in general, but also decision makers. It was news a year and a half ago that the city of Como in northern Italy, almost at the border with Switzerland, had implemented facial recognition cameras. And the local administration had bought these cameras from a company, a very controversial company that I'm not going to name, but they actually didn't know what they got themselves into. And it took some local journalists writing for the magazine Wired, the Italian edition of the Wired magazine, and experts, really, not just journalists, people who also knowledge about technology, to denounce this. And it was almost like if the local administration was like, "Oh, really? Did we do that?" Right? And there's, this is maybe an extreme case, but it's often what happens. We are blinded as a society by, the sirens, by the beauty, by the advantages of the Silicon Valley narratives around technology, and we're a bit blinded and forget to ask critical questions, whatever we stand and whatever our role is. Maybe not this crowd, right? If we are researchers, we're very much trained to asking questions, critical questions in particular, but they can go in very different ways. But let's also think about datification not only as a scary, scary force, which is probably something I convinced you of by now, but also as a productive force. And in that sense, I very much liked a short commentary. In fact, it was an introduction to a special issue of a journal, Social Media Plus Society, in 2015, written by Helen Kennedy and Thomas Powell and colleagues, that invited us to really look critically at the possibilities offered by big data and datification more in general for citizen agency. So not just imagine citizens as those on the losing end of the equation, or those that are completely powerless, right, and scared in front of technological innovation. But what they say is, like, let's look at datification as a process where, for example, you can feed, say, such data produced. They were talking in particular about social media data here, but data produced by the datafied infrastructure that we live through today. So feed such data back to users, enabling them to orient themselves into the world. So looking at essentially data and data infrastructure, not just as something that constrains for good citizens, but something that can be appropriated and reverted and changed and subverted by citizens themselves. And I hope that I have some examples of that later on for you. So, but what is agency? Now, I mentioned that a lot of my, inspiration to think about agency comes from sociology, from the very, very basic notions of general sociology. But then the question is also not only what is agency really, but where can we find it? How can we sort of foster it? How can we imagine it and pin it down, but also encourage citizens to become active forces in that process? So, agency versus structure is a. Sorry, I see that there are. I saw there were some messages, but probably it was some other. I've heard a bing in my. Maybe you also heard it, but it was not in the chat. Just to make clear, I do not see the chat as I speak. I only see the message pops up. So if you have questions, please interrupt me anytime. But also, you can simply do so by turning on your mic and using your voice, simply because it's a bit difficult to speak and not be distracted by popping messages on the chat. But I'm absolutely fine. I should have said that earlier, to be interrupted any time if there's something that you would like to ask or add and complement what I say. We're all very situated, and my perspective is, of course, partial. and very much related to where I stand right now, and cannot be generalized to the rest of the world. So that's also one extra reason to enrich this conversation with examples. So feel free to do so. Okay, but yeah, so a lot of my thinking comes from sociology, and I like very much to think in terms of agency versus structure. Agency being what we can do as citizens, as human beings. Political agency being in particular what we can do to reclaim our role as citizens of a polity. And structure being instead everything that surrounds us, everything that envelops us. So structure can be the school system, the parliament, the whatever administration system, but of course also the surveillance ecosystem, or the surveillance complex, as some scholars call it, that we live in today. So think about the overpower of a handful of corporations that I already mentioned before. So it is in this tension that I situate my work. But I like to also, expand a little bit on that, and agency, and this is very important to think about that. Sorry, to remember when we think about agency, is not a given. It's not a property that we will own simply by virtue of existing in a democracy, for example, or in a given polity. So it's just, it's something, if you want to, it's a birthright, right? Because yes, it is a citizen right, but it's a process. It's not a given. It's something that we reclaim and we engage with continuously. And I have more on that in a minute. But I also like very much the reflections by Nick Holdry from London School of Economics, who defines agency as the process of making sense of the world as to act within it. So I exclude from agency routine activities like taking out the garbage or taking the public transport to go to work. These are routine activities which, they definitely express an agency. We could probably stay on the sofa instead of taking the bus, for example, but they do not pertain necessarily or continuously to the political sphere of action of the individual. But I invite you to have a look at the article by Nicole quoted there from 2014 for the Sociological Review, because it takes a very interesting media studies perspective on agency that complements very much what I'm talking about. But then there is another very important piece that has been fundamental to my thinking about agency by Emir Baye and Nietzsche. It's from 1988. Sometimes we tend to read only articles from the last 5 years because they're the first that maybe show up on Google. But there's plenty to be learned to think about technology, also from articles and books and pieces of research that were done and written long before the internet was the complex system that we know today. Just to give you a sense, in my work on social movements, I'm very much indebted to the writings of Alberto Melucce, who is an Italian sociologist and social psychologist who died too soon of a car crash in the 90s, but that at the end of the 90s, but that really contributed to, I do believe, understand the relation between citizens and social movements and the internet, even without knowing the internet as we know it today, right? So this is just another example of how, in fact, sometimes it is even beneficial to think about agency, for example, pre-technology, so that we can more easily disentangle what is the impact on technology on these processes. But so back to this article from 1988, Emmy Baye and Michel also tell us that agency is a process. It's not a given. It's not an attribute that we own once for all. And they talk about so agency as in the engagement by actor of different structural environments, which through the interplay, and the part in red is what they then play with, right? Habit, so what we used to do. Imagination, our ability to abstract from the regular and dream a little bit, right? And plan for the better. And judgment, so our ability to distinguish and make decisions, both reproduces and transforms those structures, the structures that envelop us, right, that I mentioned earlier, in interactive responses to the problem posed by changing historical situations. So if we have to look for agency, then we have to look into the combination of habit, imagination, and judgment, and something that evolves over time. But in thinking about agency, and I do not have a slide on that, but I want to mention it anyway, together with Melucci, I'm very much indebted to the work of citizen media scholar Clemencia Rodriguez. Clemencia is Colombian by origin, but she has been working mostly in the United States of America. And she wrote a book in 2001 called, and now I cannot remember the title, something with fishers, but essentially she wrote an amazing book on what she calls citizen media in Colombia. Citizens, she refers to to ciudadanía in Spanish, which is a bit of a more extensive meaning than citizenship in English, or at least how I understand it in English, me not being a native speaker. But essentially what she refers to is not citizenship as in holding citizenship right as in a passport, but she refers to feminist understandings and approaches to citizenship and empowerment. So she refers also to the work of feminist scholars like Nancy Fraser and many others. And she basically looks at citizen media like community radios in Colombia as a key channel through which people can enact and reclaim their citizenship. The idea is that we become active agents, we reclaim our agency only in the moment in which we enact it, or in the moment in which we act upon something. And this, if you want, is similar to what Coldry mentioned, making sense of the word, so that to act politically, I would say, within it. But that's also similar to what then, Emi by Amisha called imagination and judgment. And then Clemencia Rodriguez point to with this process of enacting citizenship through citizen media. So again, going back to Emi by Amisha, here you see the full at the bottom of the slide, the full reference. It's an article published in 1988 in the American Journal of Sociology. They also say that not only it is a process, agency is a process, but it's also intentional, reflexive, informed, relational, and situated. So it is intentional, therefore excluding, as I mentioned, like routine forms of action, like taking the bus, that have no particular political meaning. Reflexive, because we build, it's the imagination that we're talking about, right? We build on what we have, our reflexive capacity of human beings, but also our past doings. Informed, in the sense that we always looked for clues and pointers. Relational, because it's never something that we just reclaim by ourselves individually. I mean, there are a lot of actions that are expression of individual agency, like voting, for example, or choosing to equip my communication. But a lot of it is anyway developed in relation to our community of peers, and it is situated, meaning it can differ, right? Our understanding of agency is also very much culturally and socially and geographically situated, so it varies across different places, let's say. But then, if we really have to look at agency, where can we identify agency in human-machine interactions? Or in the software examples that I gave you earlier, right? In this facial recognition technology, for example. Well, I like this picture very much, not only because I like Russian dolls big time, but also because it's a bit of a recursive question, and this picture, and also the very same metaphor of the Russian dolls point exactly in that direction. It's a recursive question, not only in the terms in which Chris Kelty talks about recursive publics, but also because it is a bit like spiral of asking questions, finding answers. It's pretty much never ending when we look at technological innovation today. But going back to the facial recognition technology, what I mentioned earlier already, what happens if technology is rolled out in the absence of public debate, in the absence of total democratic oversight and adequate regulation? Unfortunately, what we have seen with COVID in particular, really fast-tracked by COVID, was this speedy, fast-tracked innovation that made, without literally democratic oversight and adequate regulation. So technologies are put in place, are implemented into the urban space prior to adequate testing, adequate piloting to solve problems. I mean, techno solutionism of the pandemic points exactly to that type of development. But it's not just the pandemic, these things were happening already. This dynamic was in place, unfortunately, already before. But what happens is that once technology is adopted in time of crisis, like the pandemic, their presence is rarely ever questioned, but especially technology is here to stay. What I call early governance by data infrastructure is here to stay. It's going to haunt us for a long time. And it probably will never be reverted. So now is the time to act, and probably we're already too late in that sense. But as I said, vis-a-vis this context of lack of adequate regulation, poor democratic oversight, but also what I said earlier, poor literacy amongst the population, there's a number of bottom-up practices that point to slightly different interpretations of the datafied society, much more positive and much more promising for citizen agency or political agency, as you may want to call it. So these bottom-up data practices, they're bottom-up meaning they originate from civil society, where civil society is, embraces pretty much anyone and anything in the framework of, in the realm, so outside the realm of the state and the corporate realm, the market realm. So by civil society here, I mean non-governmental organizations, coalitions, campaigns, but also grassroots, much more informal groups, social movements, but also individual citizens that decide to take action. So all of this goes under the header, under the big umbrella of civil society, and under the big umbrella of the bottom-up data practices. And luckily, as I said, there's good news, which we need a lot of good news these days, and there's a lot of positive examples of how to reclaim agency. And in the attempt to reclaim agency and to look for agency in the datafied society, remember the Russian doll with the doctor looking, where is this agency then? Well, I want to focus on one such example, or the probably many that we have, but it's the example that I'm most familiar with, because it's what I've spent the last 6 years of my life working on, which is the realm of data activism. What is data activism? Data activism indicates mobilizations and practices which are socio-technical in nature, meaning they bring together, they need together social dimensions, but also technological dimensions, software that I mentioned earlier. And it takes a critical approach to data and certification and technological innovation more in general. Now, when I started writing about this in 2013, we really were talking exclusively about big data. Now the buzzword is artificial intelligence and machine learning. What is the next buzzword is yet to be seen. But what I want to say is that data activism tries to make sense of pretty much any of this. It takes data as a fundamental currency in society and wants to understand how it can be used, for example, for promoting social good. Now, these reflections come from, a collective project that we just finished, 14 days ago. That's why you see me still very tired after the conclusion of this big project. It was a project called Data Active. You can visit the website data-activism.net. At some point in time, we were 24 people in the team. So you can imagine that what I'm sharing here with you comes from that joint work. But also there's so much more that I cannot share in talk today. So I invite you to go to data-activism.net. And if you look at the menu at the top of the website, on the right-hand side, you see Data Active in video pills. And you can get access to 6 fantastic, I think, videos that in 10 minutes, 15 minutes sometimes, summarize the findings of 6 years of work on data activism. And you can imagine, as I said, there's so much more to be said, but watch out. There's also some PhD thesis that will be released soon, and a number of articles that have to come out in the coming months that can tell you much more about data activism and in general citizen agency in the Datafied society. But so what transforms data into activism? If we take data activism as an instance of how citizens can reclaim agency in the Datafied society, it becomes very interesting to understand how can we move from data to data activism. Why is that, for example, that we all live in the Datafied society, but only some people make the leap to become, for example, data activists? Now, data activism is a very broad umbrella, again, it's a very comfortable one, very broad. Not everyone that we looked at, interviewed over this and worked with over the last 6 years defines herself a data activist. But data activism is, points to this any form of practice that takes a critical approach, as I mentioned. So we include into data activism, for example, digital rights activism, anti-surveillance activism, open data and transparency activism, whereby citizens trying to reclaim information in the form of open data from their public administration. But also data journalism can be seen when it is done with social change. Ethos in mind can be seen as a form of data activism, because it really takes this critical approach and wants to promote in society this critical approach to data. But so what happens then in this shift between data into data activism? And I wanted to share with you a piece of good news. I mentioned earlier, not everything is bad news when we talk about artificial intelligence, but that's also the time in which we have to act as citizens. This is a screenshot from reclaimyourface.eu, which is a campaign launched in December 2020. So it's a campaign that is now like 8 months old. That asks all, in this case, European Union citizens to make a move to ask the European Union to ban facial recognition software, facial recognition technologies, and cameras in particular, from public space within the the European Union. Now, why should you care if you're not in the European Union? Well, unfortunately, you cannot participate actively, meaning what this campaign is doing is now trying to, so they started in February, at the end of February 2021, they have time until February 2022 to gather 1 million signatures from at least 7 member countries of the EU. And in case they are successful, the European Union, so this is a form of petition, of bottom-up petition system, set in place by the European Union to enable a sizable number of citizens. Of course, you have to have decent support, and 1 million people is decent support, to prove that you want legislation on facial recognition. Now, if you follow a little bit politics of the European Union, you might have noticed that there's been a white paper on AI shared last year. And there's been even more recently a document on shared, leaked, but in fact it was shared shortly afterwards, on facial recognition technology. And there's a hint of hope in there, in that the European Union has raised concerns about all of this, but there's much more to do. So what this campaign says is that biometric surveillance objectifies, commodifies, and dehumanizes people. By reducing us to this, you see that also in the picture, to a number of distances in our face. By the way, facial recognition technology also tracks down ways of walking and other features of the human body, not just the face, but of course the face is the one that we tend to consider a bit more private in our body parts, or when we want to be recognized or we want to hide ourselves. And but it's important to participate, to spread the voice about this campaign. Also, if you're not a European Union citizen, for 2 reasons. One, because any rule of the European Union sets in place applies to anyone on its soil, even if you're not a European citizen. So even if you live in Europe, or if you are, or if you ever travel to Europe, then you can be sure that there are some, hopefully there will be some good policies in place. But second, the much more important reason why it is important to take action now, even if you're not European citizens, is because Europe has a normative ambition of offering legislation. Think about the General Data Protection Regulation that is considered progressive and the new gold standard. Although sometimes this legislation is far from perfect, but it represents a leap forward in the protection of citizen rights and human rights in particular, like privacy or data protection. So a lot of what happens in Europe is then copied or copycat or simply repurposed or looked at from other parts of the world. So it's important that also to support the Reclaim Your Face campaign. You see there at the bottom of the screen the URL, reclaimyourface.eu. But this is an example of a bottom-up data practice and an initiative that it gives me personally a lot of hope. Because as we're going to see in a minute when I get to the concluding part of my talk today, one big problem that we have into this transition between data and data activism, or in this attempt to reclaim citizen agency, political agency in the datafied society, is the literacy that I already mentioned, the fact that we do perceive it as very complicated or overly complicated, overly abstract. We give in to this imaginary of technological magic, of the technological sublime, as Moscow calls it, that in a way already attributes all agency to the technology and gives us very little room of intervention. But the second problem is also one of imaginaries. Our lack or poor imagination when it comes to finding ways to interact with technology in a meaningful way. Not only because, of course, technology is convenient ultimately. So, I mean, I might be concerned about geolocation on my phone, but I'm ultimately very happy if I visit Berlin that, my phone, if I have geolocation on, gives me the right recommendation about the, restaurants that they are in line with my taste and feeding preferences, right? If I'm vegetarian, I get only vegetarian recommendation because Google knows me very well. And Google incidentally might know that I'm in Berlin at that precise moment. So there is an element of convenience, but there's also this technological sublime and this sort of magic that surrounds, Silicon Valley narratives that in a way discourages, not prevents literally, but discourages alternative imaginaries to emerge. But we're going to see in a minute that in fact this is about to change, or there's many instances in which at a grassroots level, groups are organizing to produce a change in this respect. Now, I'd like to introduce you a notion that I am playing with, I've been playing with for a couple of years already, and I never really put into writing. You also see some very strange Greek writing there because I have classical training, and I like to look very much at the origins of words to see whether there's some hint that we can get from that. For example, I very much like to think about technology and data as a form of technology, looking at the Greek etymology of the word, so the Greek origin of the noun technology, which is in techne, where technology, we consider it as a tool, right? As something that someone gives us to do something else, to perform something else. But technology, in the Greek origin of the word, actually meant something much more proactive. It indicated our ability to make and perform. So our form of engagement, in a way, agency with a specific tool, not just the tool in itself. So something that, as Sandra Brahma wrote in 2001, engineering and art have in common, the doing, the crafting. So, if you think about data as technology and technology as crafting, then you understand that you already reclaim the agency in changing the way you think about what we deal with on a regular basis. But I'd like to introduce this neologism of data logis, which refers to data and information, and logos, as a way where logos indicates a way of making sense, and data, of course, refer to datification. So data logis, sorry, I cannot even pronounce it myself, is a way of taking apart the Russian doll. You see that in the picture, but it's also a way of making sense of datification. Now, of course, we have to talk about logis in the plural, of ways of making sense in the plural, because there's never only one way of making sense of it. There are many different perspectives in the world, but I think it's very important that so to transform data into data activism, to reclaim agency, we have to get through the step of making sense of datification, not just, withdrawing because we are scared of it, or we feel that we have nothing to say and we have to ignore it. How do we do that? Well, there are two elements in particular that I would like to refer to. One is the issue of literacy. You might have noticed that I already mentioned data literacy and digital literacy and literacy in general already a few times in this talk. In fact, this is a long-term obsession of mine. As a scholar of datification, I also would like to explore ways in which we can foster the adoption of literacy amongst the citizenry at large. Because, for example, take the school programs. We tend to, we in most school programs around the world, there's also what we may call civic education. In the Netherlands, not only there's civic education, meaning you understand how the state works around you, that there is a king and there's a parliament and stuff like that, how to vote. But children are also taught how to swim. Why is that? Because if you're familiar with the Netherlands landscape, there's a lot of water. So if you are a child that falls into a canal, then this is swimming, surviving, in fact, floating, and being able to get out of the canal becomes, of course, a critical skill, right, to be a citizen of the Netherlands. Now, it shocks me personally as a citizen of, Italy, literally, but also the Netherlands, that we, as a society, care so much about training our children, as those that are the citizens of the future, to understand how the state works, but not, and maybe to swim and survive in a complex environment with a lot of water, but we do give enough attention or not adequate attention to forming digital citizens. But the digital is more and more important, right? And more the digital and algorithms mediate fundamental relations with the state, fundamental steps of becoming citizens. So data literacy is of fundamental importance, and I'm going to conclude actually on a positive note on that. And the other is, and there's not by chance, that is Alice in Wonderland, one of my favorite books here, because that's all about imagination, of course. It's the ability to create, to originate, to foster a critical imagination about technology that we desperately need. So datalogies then, they refer to, we can imagine them as the alternative epistemologies, so the alternative ways of making sense of data, coupled with alternative ways of engaging with datification. Together, they originate the datalogies. So and I have some concrete examples, as those ways of making sense of the datification, big data, and artificial intelligence from the bottom up. Now, I understand this is all a bit abstract, and that's why I would like to take you, and we are coming quickly to a conclusion, through three very concrete examples of how grassroots groups have over time tried to come up with alternative epistemologies, but especially alternative imaginaries. So what I call here, critical, in that of light with critical imagination. And to do that, I'd like to share an article that recently came out from in 2001, co-authored with Becky Kazansky, one of my PhD students, who's about to finish a PhD, very exciting. Watch out for Becky's work because it's totally cutting edge and very interesting. Becky works mostly on resistance to datification, so how civil society and human rights defenders try to react and interact and make sense of surveillance and threats that come from surveillance. But this piece in particular that was published in New Media and Society, it's open access, so you can share it. It's entitled Bodies Not Templates. And we looked into how citizens and grassroots groups try to make that claim, right? Bodies not templates, in fact, comes from the activists themselves. In resisting facial recognition technology, they wanted to put on the table that we're bodies with our identity, with our feelings, with our rights, not just templates that you can reproduce and play around with, not just data to trade, right? But like that group that we looked at, other groups also are trying to contest dominant algorithmic imaginaries. And by dominant algorithmic imaginaries, we can, everything that goes with, the smart city imaginary, the Silicon Valley, marketing narratives and so on and so forth. So how are all of these flamboyant narratives of fake empowerment resisted by grassroots data activists. And I give you 3 examples. So we use the notion of counter-imaginalism, in particular in this case, as as another word to indicate what we put here, alternative epistemologies, so alternative ways of thinking or making sense of technology. And we look at specifically at 3 problems. So the challenge of digitally secure computing. So how can we make sure that our own laptops, our own machines are safe to use, and reduce? How can we reduce to the best of our possibilities intrusions by malicious actors? This is particularly important, of course, for human rights defenders living in authoritarian countries. But also, how can we make sense of the Internet of Things as a increasingly complex and omnipresent technological environment around us? But also, how can we make sense of facial recognition technologies? And in the response to these 3 types of technologies, we identified different stages that I list here very, very briefly, just to make you curious. You can read more about that. I'm not going to spend too many words, but essentially, in the creation of what we call counter-imaginaries or alternative epistemologies, there are different. We can imagine at least 3 different steps. So where you have, starting from the bottom of the slide, a speculative response. So new technology, people have to make sense of it. It's complicated. So there's this speculative attempt to make a problem thinkable, right? And that's the case, for example, facial recognition technology, whereby civil society is still trying to come to grips with what it really meant. But this article was actually written before the launch of the campaign to share the Reclaim Your Face campaign. So probably now facial recognition technology has already moved up 1 step to being a formative response. So civil society has elaborated a formative response. For example, in elaborating also concrete technical intervention. And then the stabilized response instead concern the phase in which basically counter-imaginaries of resistance and response have been elaborated, and it's also and civil society actors and data activists feel they're on top of the problem. Now, of course, these 3 steps that we identified change over time. They're not, with technological evolution, it becomes more and more difficult for civil society groups to follow up, to keep up with technological innovation. So there's more and more threats, and it's more and more difficult to articulate a response. So, these 3 stages are not necessarily a positive progression from speculative to stabilized, but you can also, go back as groups try to come to grips with increasingly complex technology. And here I want to show you, to point to CV Dazzle. So this is what we call a speculative response to facial recognition technology. So still in the initial stage, whereas the campaign that I point you to, it's a more advanced step already. But this was an attempt to use creative makeup to hide fundamental traits of your face. Now, as it happens, facial recognition technology, I mentioned it already, doesn't necessarily look at features, but looks at distances between various points of the face. So in fact, as it turns out, makeup, no matter how creative, no matter how invasive and colorful on your face, it's not really the right answer. The best answer, as CV Dazzle, this project elaborated, in fact, concerns this, like hiding your face with hair, right? Although now with facial recognition developments, following the pandemic, this might not even be enough. But essentially, this is CV Dazzle is a project that's tried to use fashion and makeup to respond, or to respond to facial recognition threats. But in fact, the attempt, as you can imagine, is not to tell everyone, hey, just wear intrusive, very colorful makeup every time you go to work, so that if you step across facial recognition technology, you can hide. Well, good luck with that. It's really complicated, right? To do that in practice. The point is not necessarily to really force people or encourage people to do so, but to make people think. And that's why this is what we call a speculative, so a counter-imaginary of facial recognition technology, which is still in a speculative phase. So it's an attempt to make something thinkable, to bring down, or to identify, let's say, what are the threats and make them understandable by the citizen at large. Another example is Dowser. Dowser is an intervention. It's a technical intervention. It's that box that you see there, white box. It's not yet in production, but you can build it yourself if you contact the creators. You see also the picture I have there is a screenshot of the website. So there's also download function because this is open source software. DAOZ is what they call an awareness box for the Internet of Things. So the idea is that our houses, our intimate space is going to be more and more technological in the future. So imagine the fridge reminding you that you're running out of milk or whatever else, right? But also, there's not much control of, with everything being connected to the internet, or more and more connected to the internet, there's less and less ability to control potential negative intrusions. Think about the robot Hoovers, for example. I have one, it's awesome, but operated through my phone. But a hacker might, for example, intrude and make it do weird things. Now you can imagine that a Hoover can only, the extent of the damage is limited, I guess, right? But what I want to say is that there's more and more in our home environment that is connected to the internet. How can we know if there is an intrusion? So whereas, for example, if there is a burglary, someone coming in to steal your stuff, you normally identify it, right? Because the lock is broken, a window is broken, or something like that. It's nearly impossible to find it out about intrusions online. So what this little box does is, as they call it, a switch on/off button for the Internet of Things. Not only because you can indeed switch off all these devices at once through this machine, but also because you see there's a little red light in the picture. The machine emits a sound and a light anytime any of your devices connect to the internet, whereby allowing you to decide whether that's a legitimate connection, or, for example, it is a mean, malicious actor trying instead to sneak in your home network. So this is what we call a formative response to the to a problem of that relates to technology or the datafied society, because as you can see, there's already a concrete technical intervention, although it's still not brought to the market. But what about, for example, a stabilized response? Do we have an example of that? Yes, we do. This is Cube's operating system. Cubes is one of the many meaning like handful still, but several examples of operating systems that want to be, as it says here, reasonably secure. Meaning these are operating systems that allow you, Cubes in particular, what it does, and you can download it and good luck with that. It's fun. It's also a bit complex, but it's very beautiful. What it does is it allows you to create separate machines, separate virtual machines on your home machines, on your laptop, I mean, where you can keep completely separate identities. Let's say you are a human rights activist living in an authoritarian country, but you also want to shop on Amazon, for example, or go online to search for information. You may want to keep your activism identity separate from your shopping identity. You might want to do so even if you're not a human rights defender in an authoritarian country, but simply because you don't want to be, you want to be fully part of the datafied machine of corporations. So what you do, you download the Cubes and you imagine essentially for yourself how many discrete machines, separate virtual machines you want to set up in your system. Now, this is what we call a stabilized response to a social technical problem, because the problem of identity or sharing one identity and having different activities online, right, the profiling that happens online, has been domesticated with a technical fix, which in this case is a bit of a complex to use, but functioning operating systems called Cubes. As you said, it's open source and you can download it online. So these are just some examples of how people have, acted on the technical, but also just on the fun level, like CV does with makeup against facial recognition technology, to help citizens to make sense, to develop those counter-imaginaries, those alternative epistemologies that combine with practices of engagement, critical practices of engagement, originate what I call datalogies. They are instances, if you want, data activism broadly defined, but they really point to ways in which we can reclaim our agency and control and sovereignty in the datafied society. Now, to conclude, two brief points. One is, what role do we have to play as academics or as students, as observers, as privileged observers of the datafied society, where we have a very important critical role to play. In the creation of counter imaginaries, we can be, we can help doing the diagnosis, we can be help by engaging in storytelling, we can help being what we already do, probably educating younger generations. We can be translators. And translators, I do not mean just translating between different languages, but between the language of datification, which sometimes is technical and obscure, and the daily languages of the people that surround us. We can be skill transferers. And for example, data journalists often are skill transferers in the sense that they tell and share their knowledge with other people to tell them how to also themselves play with data and reclaim agency in the datafied society. But we can also be facilitators into this effort by civil society and by the citizenry at large to create beautiful counter imaginaries and alternative epistemologies. So there's a lot of work to do. And especially if you think about what I mentioned, like the need, imperative today, really, and the moral need, obligation also from our side to contribute to the data literacy of society. We cannot afford in 2021 and looking forward not to be informed citizens when it comes to interacting with the datafied society. We have to be able, for example, to detect and complain about fraud like it happened, for example, in the Netherlands now. There, it was thanks to some politicians, thanks to some non-governmental organizations, but citizens themselves also have a role to play, and of course, scholars as well, as privileged observers. And a final word on methods to reclaim agency, I want to point to the fact that as part of the data active process, citizens, also low-skill users of social media and shopping platforms, to reflect a bit about the technology in itself, but reflecting particularly about the data that is offered to them and the impact that such data has in their life. What do I mean? I point to a number of tools which are part of the tracking exposed software suite, I can say. And these are software tools that you can download. They are browser extension, they're open source software. You can install them in your browser. They only work on laptops, not on your phone, unfortunately. But if you are a user of Facebook, YouTube, Amazon, but even Pornhub, then you can see how personalization algorithms impact your worldview. How, for example, you might be served certain prices on Amazon. Amazon practices dynamic pricing, for example, that are different from other people, simply based on your consumption history, sorry, and the profiling that happens in these platforms. But also, it's not just about shopping. There's also leisure, like Pornhub, but it's also about the formation of political opinion. So what we did through the project called Algorithms Exposed, here you see all the relevant URLs. You see, you can have access to the tools and the instances. Like now, for example, we have a digital method summer school in Amsterdam that can help you and others, of course, as well, to see what is the influence of personalization algorithms on your life. Meaning, what I want to point to is that we also have a role to play in developing software that helps citizens to reflect on, for example, their information diet as part of creating a healthy data literacy within a society. So without further ado, I leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have.